right now, at this very moment, as we sit here together, as you watch me, if you are indeed watching me, everything says all green on my side, but who knows? Perhaps some weird quirk of the universe is preventing you from actually being here. But whoever gets the opportunity to sit here with me as I speak and can listen to the sound of my voice, there is something that is exciting that is taking place in the Democratic Party. I know the Democratic Party convention has just stopped. Fair enough. But under the seams, in this electoral space, as Trump and the Republican Party do theirs, there's something that is that much more interesting and that much more exciting that is taking place in our election system, or let's say from the Democratic Party's electoral system. And it needs to be honored and recognized. Now, let's segue into this, or the lead into this, has to do with Rahm Emanuel. And Rahm Emanuel, as loathsome as he is, said something that is pissing a lot of lefties off, but are completely true. Just because you don't like what somebody says, just because a person is loathsome, doesn't necessarily mean that what they're telling you is wrong. And in this very specific instance, I've said this in the past. I've made an argument to it in the past. But Rahm Emanuel is speaking directly to a point and a strategy that elucidates something from the standpoint of the left and from all of these other lefties who have these things that they want to accomplish. Rahm Emanuel is making a point. The Democratic Party is making a point. It is overt at this point, even though it is not something that has been overtly stated, up until the point of Rahm Emanuel, who just did. You better listen to Rahm Emanuel, whether you like him or not. And I would argue that what I've been saying over the past, let's say, several months, especially about active action and assertive action, and that your space and your strength is not just something that is used in a political space of a vote, but is also in what you do around your political space. And for the longest time, your politics, the things that you've been told, have basically did their best to put you to sleep and just believe in a false unity as politics went along, putting one random Democrat in regardless, blue no matter who, and allow the political space to move further and further to the right, entirely because you were too terrified of whatever Republican at that various thing. And you were always told you got to vote for the blue no matter who. Any random Democrat is better than any random Republican, etc., etc., etc. With all accountability in your political space drained away, and any notion of you getting your policy agenda accomplished that represents the interests of the left, basically the FDR Democrats of the batch, not only gets sublimated where it's not spoken of, not talked about, not even brought up to the level of debate. It's one Republican, one Democrat. They're talking about stuff, and that's the stuff that we keep the conversation on, is extremes, which are basically the extreme of a point, narrow focus, where people have these other concerns that they need and desperately need in other cases. But there's something happening, and I want to explain it. I want to explain it even just to give somewhat of an analogy to begin with. Fast food workers go on strike. Those workers say, we want at least $15 an hour. If you want to operate a company in the United States, fair enough. But one condition is that if you operate, part of the operational costs is that the employees that you hire, you have to pay them a wage that is commensurate with their ability to live. They're not being extravagant, but we're talking about just a random person getting a house, being in a home, etc., etc. They do the work, they should get that hourly wage. And for the longest time, they weren't getting those wages. The boss gets to the point where he sees these organized workers out there with their signs. He sees the public and everybody else getting to this mindset of, yeah, maybe $15 is not all that bad. And the boss, who is a person himself, understands that they're organized against him, says, fine, I'm going to get a burger flipping robot. And I'm going to put that burger flipping robot and I'm going to fire all of the fry cooks. And if anybody else says anything to me, I am going to go further and shut this down and put in an automated system where I just need one guy who does the thing and the people come up and pick up their sandwiches on the side. Test me. The burger flipping robot costs $14.50. The employees cost $15 an hour. And him doing that gives ideas to other restaurants who start to do the same. So the people who push it for $15 an hour eventually start not to do that. And in other cases, just get fired altogether. Because again, you could save 50 cents on the person. That boss took action to mitigate what it considered a problem. Now, you can say that boss is wrong. You can say that boss is right. You can say that employees were right to strike. However you want to appraise that, that is literally what happened. The boss understood that he was in competition with his workers, because that competition always exists in a capitalistic enterprise. Those employees want to get more money for what they do. The boss wants to pay them less, because that allows him to make more. And in this very specific case, he transitioned out of those workers because those workers were being a pain in his ass. And so that's what the boss did and started to save 50%. Whether it's right, wrong, indifferent, whatever you want to peruse it, I'm just making the point that it's a competition. Two sides. One side wants additional wages and additional benefits, etc. The other side doesn't want to give it. And those sides are at loggerheads. What happens? One side tries to mitigate any notion of an advantage in the other side. If those workers did that 20 years ago, those workers would have been able to do that in a way where that boss couldn't compensate by putting in a robot. The fact that technology got to a certain point undermined the strength of the workers in that enterprise. What I'm telling you, that's all across the United States. This is not something where you have in perpetuity where you can not act. At some point, there can be a technology that undermines your job, meaning your ability to strike, your ability to bitch, moan, and everything else gets curtailed by a loss of power in the labor market. This is something that is problematic, and many of the things that take place, hopefully, we're still at the point where workers in labor have the ability to shut down and control how things operate. But if it ever gets to the point where machinery can do the overwhelming majority of it, then workers become somewhat irrelevant. That analogy explains everything that is shaking and moving in your Democratic Party right now. Whatever you want to think about the Democratic Party, you can talk about the Civil War, everything else, but that analogy, that conflict, that consternation between those two sides, two competitors, is literally what is happening right now. Lefties are bitching and moaning about it, but they're not necessarily understanding it in a systemic, strategic way to which it's operating. There's a faction of the Democratic Party, and that faction, that third way Democrat, that 1% that basically sets the tone, policy, cadence, and everything else of the party, including whatever propaganda they need to put out to try to cloak themselves. That group, the media contacts with the oligarchs, those guys want to maintain power. And they look at the world and say, how do we do that? They understand that they are in competition with another group that doesn't quite even understand itself yet. Meaning that group is still nascent. That group is still young. It hasn't necessarily formed a political identity where all of them come together under that particular identity and they can develop their own brain trust. Even though there's movements to that. There's agitations to that. And because, like any good strategist, that brain trust says we can no longer trust that. Or at the very least, we will not be able to trust that for long. And like the boss looks at that and says that needs to be mitigated. And like those workers, hopefully it hasn't gotten to the point where the boss can't mitigate it by putting in a robot or putting in something else. But the boss actually has to negotiate or let the business go bust. The Democratic Party is trying to fix an error, a problem, a defect, a weakness in their political setup. And Rahm Emanuel is telling you exactly what they're doing to try to fix it. What I am telling you is to not give them time and space to do it. And the fact that they are trying to do it is giving testament to, just like the boss recognizing an issue, them recognizing a weakness, one of which I am screaming at the hilt that we all need to exploit, and that cowardice cannot be justification for righteous, moral, ethical balking, bitching, moaning, refusing to acquiesce and refusing to accept. But that is exactly the error that Rahm Emanuel is trying to fix. Let's talk about it, because I think this is one of the most interesting things that has taken place in politics. And Emanuel just confirmed what we could see with our own eyes. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. There were a lot of people angry and pissed off at Rahm Emanuel today or yesterday. I woke up at like 5 in the morning and all these things on Twitter. Personally, I appreciate this by Rahm Emanuel. It takes a certain amount of stones to say what Rahm Emanuel did. And, whether lefties are paying attention to this or not, you should. The problem that lefties have, at least in the beginning, is that you don't understand that you are not Democrats. That's the first point. You don't entirely understand that Democrats, especially the brain trust, no longer sees you as Democrats. That's the second point. You also miss the point that you're nascent and you need to somehow cobble together with a certain degree of courage where you understand that you are something fundamentally different than what they are, despite being in the Democratic Party. And because you don't understand that, because that hasn't set in yet, it's something that takes time to some degree to set in, you could be exploited and attacked in a way that undermines any notion of your relevance or power that you have not yet been able to grab. They get it that you have it. You don't get it that you have it. And because you don't necessarily get it that you have it, it becomes difficult for you to organize and use that in any kind of way of creating a bulwark or any kind of way of accessing some degree of leverage. They're seeking to mitigate those levers of potential power. And I'm making the point that you better pay attention to this, because it is something that, if it does work, they would have basically liberated themselves from your influence. And any notion of irrelevance and taking you for granted that takes place, all of that stuff at that point that used to be conceptual, meaning we can keep you under wraps with a conceptual argument to do so. Well, it becomes a little bit different when it's, no, we can keep you under wraps, not just conceptually, where you think about this and you have your own stuff in a prison of sorts, of least, worse, and blue no matter who and all that nonsense. But no, we can literally keep you as irrelevant because we have something else that can mitigate your influence that was there beforehand. Even if we can't mitigate it all the way, mitigate it enough to undermine your relevance just that much more. That's why I deem this to be really important and I deem it to be really interesting. So let's start here. 2016. That's 2016. Let's go there. No. Let's go here first. Let's go to Rahm Emanuel. So, first, Joe Biden goes into a room with a bunch of oligarchs. And the event was headlined by John Gray, a top executive at Blackstone Group, private equity behemoth at the center of the climate, health, housing, and pension crisis. Now, Blackstone had already donated to Biden $130,000 to Biden's campaign and $350,000 to Biden's super PAC that was backing Biden. So basically, these guys are putting in a ton of money with Joe Biden. Biden is sitting in with them, one of them. The second question was asked by Gray, who noted that there are a bunch of business leaders on the line. What do you think is essential to getting the economy rolling again? Biden says, I come from a corporate state of America. Many of you incorporated here, Mr. Biden said. It used to be that corporate America had a sense of responsibility beyond CEO salaries and shareholders. Corporate America has to change its ways. It's not going to require legislation. I'm not proposing any. We've got to think about how we deal people back in. Basically, look, I'm not changing anything. And at a certain point, Biden notes, nothing is going to fundamentally change right here. Biden repeated his earlier remarks that he didn't want to demonize the wealthy, added, though income inequality is a problem that must be addressed under the presidency, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing will fundamentally change. I need you very badly. I hope if I win this nomination, I won't let you down. He's talking to oligarchs. Here's another point. At a meeting just before Biden gave that nothing, empty, vacuous, inert speech, these guys were talking to the Washington Journal. And this tidbit was in the Wall Street Journal. Former Delaware Senator Ted Kaufman, a Biden confidant who succeeded him in Senate, predicted during the Wall Street Journal Newsmakers Live interview Tuesday that a large increase in federal spending would be difficult to achieve in 2021. When we get in the pantry, it's going to be bare, Mr. Kaufman, who is leading Mr. Biden's transition team. When you see what Trump has done to the deficit, forget about COVID-19, all of the deficits that he built up over the incredible cuts. So we're going to be limited. He's making the point that we're going to be limited in regards to what we can do. Now, explain to me, How can Joe Biden put out this $3 trillion climate bill, or how much ever it's going to cost, and whatever he was talking about during the primaries, and yet the person who's running the transition team is basically saying there's no money to do any of that, so, got to find something else. We're limited. Biden was able to get past everybody else, and now you have nowhere else to go, so you're basically stuck with whatever Biden comes up with. And many people would forget anything that he said in the primary because it becomes this intense tunnel vision between Biden and Trump, especially when Democrats are looking at the race, because the overwhelming majority, I think like 70%, are voting for Joe Biden to get Trump out of office. So all notions of policy that you might have wanted, that you might have believed that you could get, that you had this invisible energy to push Biden to the left, you are not. You don't. And he will not be moved to the left. At least, not without a demand to do so and a credible threat to do so. I'm making the point to you that Biden had already signaled to you that you're not going to get this stuff. He told people on more than one occasion, go vote for somebody else. I'm making the point that he's already signaled status quo. Whatever that means, status quo. It goes further. You get Democrats putting out a litany of Republicans on stage during the DNC convention. Isn't that some shit? Now, part of that is, yes, to push back on these notions that, the left is going to be running Joe Biden. That was always farcical and nonsensical in and of itself. But to push back on that, you trot out the Republicans that are backing Biden. He even has the Nazi Republicans. Look at this one right here. Richard Spencer. Freedom-loving Nazi. I plan to vote for Biden in a straight Democratic ticket. It's not based on accelerationism or anything like that. The liberals are clearly more competent people. You even get the Richard Spencers of the world. So Joe Biden trots these guys out. But it's not just optics. It's not just minimizing and making progressives irrelevant. You make yourself irrelevant. I hope you understand that. That's a mental cage. Your irrelevance in this is just highlighted by the fact that he's doing this, that he's trotting out these Republicans, that these people are saying these things about, nothing is going to fundamentally change to the world because everything was just great until Trump got in office. Here's another point, Rahm Emanuel. Now, Rahm Emanuel comes out and says this and pisses everybody off. But what he's saying here is true. Listen to what he's saying. Let's listen to talk after.
But you believe that there's actually an opportunity for Vice President Biden to reach across the aisle and to pull some of these never-Trumpers into the Democratic Party permanently. You wrote earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, we don't want these voters simply to rent the Democratic Party to remove Mr. Trump from the Oval Office. We want them to buy into our agenda so that they fuel legislative victories through the next decade on our core issues. How possible do you think that actually is, given that the majority of voters in either party say that their main motivation for voting this year is to vote against the other guy?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I wrote in that piece also that 1980 was the touchstone for an election. That was the year of the Reagan Democrat. This will be the year of the Biden Republicans. You can see the Biden campaign with John Kasich, Cindy McCain, Colin Powell, et al. Made a direct appeal to them. This is an election, in my view, that's kind of got two things. Donald Trump's got depth. He has his 41%. He drills down hard on them. He hasn't grown it all, but he's trying to energize that base and keep it really mobilized. Joe Biden's got breadth. He's got 4-star generals on one end and Black Lives protesters on the other end. That is a very broad coalition. And if with a concentration, not only through the election, but governing, you can take Biden Republicans who do not like the anti-science, do not like the anti-diversity, the hostility to other that comes out of the Republican Party, culturally move them into a comfort zone where they're more self-identified with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. That's what the Reagan Democrats did starting in 80 and 80.
We want to move these people to a place where they start to self-identify with the Democratic Party. People who basically are like the Kasichs of the world, or like the all of these Republicans basically who don't like the anti-science stuff. But they say, look, the Democratic Party has become enough of a corporate party and their policies have moved enough to the right that, if Ronald Reagan was alive today, he'd probably be a Democrat. And I want him, Rahm Emanuel, and the Democratic Party wants to get these Republicans to start saying, okay, I'm a Democrat. Maybe I couldn't say that before. Maybe I don't like all the policies that's on the left. But basically, The people who they're reaching out to and everything else, and basically what this party has basically done, Democrat. Now the problem is identity. And not identity in the sense of I'm a Democrat. It's that the party has ensconced itself into this notion of identity to such a degree that I have a hard time believing this works. I just do. Now, if there's a Republican that is in a position of saying, okay, fair enough, I don't have any issue with none of these identity things, and fair enough, you may get those people. So there may be a probability of people that you get. The question becomes, is that probability enough to win? But not just the probability enough to win, enough to offset your left. If you are focusing on these guys, if you're trying to get these guys to start identifying with the Democratic Party, what happens to the area further to the left that you used to wink at least, in order to get them to also identify with you? The cruel secret or the cruel trick here is that they can wink out to try to get these guys, because the overwhelming majority of people who are in the Democratic Party that consider themselves lefties, the political equivalent of the battered wife, will stay out of outright terror at the Republican. Meaning they accept the blue no matter who stuff. They're terrified of the Republicans. They accept they have nowhere else to go. So the Democrats can move to the right because you've already have a captive audience on this side. Now, Rahm Emanuel says something else. Let's hear him one more time in a second clip. One more. Wrong way.
He's that part of the party as well. And to be sure, the 110-page policy document that he released.
By the way, before we move on, how disgusting is it that a man, Rahm Emanuel, will be talking about Black Lives Matter, saying the Democrats basically have neutered Black Lives Matter and has appropriated it into the party. So we have that energy, we have that depth to it. Rahm Emanuel hid a murder. The cops in his area apparently murdered a 17-year-old, basically a child. And Rahm Emanuel, as mayor, conspired with the police department to keep that under wraps for over a year. That's who that is. Rahm Emanuel, that guy right here, right there. The one who's saying Democrats have depth because they have Black Lives Matter. And he's talking about this for a candidate who constructed the mean-spiritedness that is in our criminal justice system right now. Did it from the top. Go back, look at those videos where Joe Biden was a maniac. He's talking about, I do everything but hang him in this bill. Or further, chastising Ronald Reagan for not using the death penalty enough. You don't murder enough people with the power of the state that I, Joe Biden, in my bill, have given you. Go back, listen to those tapes. Put that in the context of what he just said. We have Black Lives Matter on our side as a party. You know what he didn't say? Lefties. Didn't say lefties. He didn't have to. You are irrelevant. Not cosmically so, but you make yourself irrelevant in the attitude, the argumentation, the framing of the world that you've accepted. And to be fair, that you've been taught over the last 40 years, even from somebody like Sanders in 2016 and 2020. Listen to what Rahm Emanuel says on this one. One last one.
The Biden-Sanders tax force earlier this summer, that was not a moderate document. So what evidence do you have that he would actually govern as a moderate?
Well, first of all, look, I have two things I would say if I was advising on an administration. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. You got this thing called an election beforehand. We still believe in democracy. But one is there's no new Green Deal. There's no Medicare for all. Probably the single two topics that were discussed the most. That's not even in the platform. Joe Biden has been very specific about the direction he wants to take. And if, from a political strategy, developing a policy both that solves the problems, number one, but then builds the cohesion of that coalition. I would have progressive ends with moderate means. And I think that's a way you make sure that you keep this coalition from ever tipping too far either way. And to date, let me just take the measure. He's done a very good job of keeping the progressive wing and a more moderate wing in the same tent without becoming an easy target for Donald Trump and the Republicans. Remember, part of the Republicans was not only appeal to soft Republicans or anti-Trump Republicans, it was also to give Joe Biden what I call his inoculation shots, because and I know next week the Trump campaign is going to put out this secret photo of Joe Biden in his camouflage outfit with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and say he's this big lefty. And so this, John Kasich and Colin Powell don't exactly endorse and support big P progressive policies.
If they don't support those policies, and those are the people who you're talking about identifying with from the standpoint of the Democratic Party, then the left will not get what it wants. Medicare for All has 88% support among Democrats. The reason why I usually use the term the Democratic elite, the upper echelon of the party, the third way Democrats and the way that they interact with one another, whether they coalesce monthly for a meeting or whether they just have the same idea, point of view of the world, and they understand that they need to keep the same cadence and everything else with the party, they do work in those terms. The Republicans that they're bringing in the party, and that, as Emanuel said, they're trying to keep, they're not doing progressive stuff. He couldn't even make the argument that they were, and basically said, look, the people who we're trying to keep are not into that progressive stuff, and we're not even doing that progressive stuff. You don't have to worry about that with Joe Biden. 88% support among Democrats, and they're telling people to kick rocks. 70% support among the rest of the public. And I hate to point this out again, but there were 20 million people left unemployed, without health care or without health insurance before COVID-19. And all of these people have lost their jobs, 20, 30 million people. And they also lost their health care, tens of millions. So within the context of something that has the size and the scale of the Great Depression, the response that Rahm Emanuel was just, look, don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about Joe Biden going to the left. Look at all the Republicans who we're trying to bring into the party. And if indeed we're trying to bring them into the party, clearly we're not going to be doing the progressive stuff because they wouldn't like it, right? They have nowhere else to go. We don't have to appeal to them. They have nowhere else to go. Now, that's not flat fact true, by the way. But it is something that over the last 40 years, lefties have gotten into their heads as if it is their responsibility to keep the world from falling off the axis. And as such, I have to vote for this random person regardless of this vote in disincentivizing or making my life worse because it makes me that much more irrelevant when I go along with this vote. But they never hit on the point that it is the candidate's responsibility to get your vote. And if you are supporting a policy that has 88% support and a candidate tells you kick rocks, then there is something wrong in that relationship because at that point they're no longer representing your interests, they're representing somebody else's interests and using fear in order to get you to make that vote. And honestly, a good dosing of propaganda to get you into the belief set that it is your responsibility to get that guy elected. That's a flat fact. Hillary Clinton got $1 billion to get elected. First and foremost, low bar. That was her first job. You get that job by catering to the various populations and saying, here's what I want to implement. And the public saying, okay, we like that, and we'll get on. If you don't do that well enough, then you lose. And that's what happened. She lost. I'm saying from lefties, if you have this notion that it is your philosophical responsibility to vote for whoever random blue that goes up, I would like to disabuse you of that. That's not true. A testament to that's not true is that Rahm Emanuel, Joe Biden, all of these Republicans that have just entered the party, where the party is making a straight out pitch to Republicans, why do you think they're doing that? Do you think they would do that if they thought it was sold up? They do that because they believe they have enough of the left captured. But on top of that, they are fearful that some of the political tactics that can be used, especially if it seems like they're losing their grip with this kind of mental hypnosis of blue no matter who, and you must vote for the Democrat, or African Americans who are now saying, hey, I think they're taking us for granted, or lefties who are saying, hey, I don't particularly like this, I'm not making a vote. It concerns them. It makes them wary of whether or not this particular motif is going to be able to continue in perpetuity into the future. And the Republican side of this is to mitigate the progressive base. That's all this is. That's exactly, literally what this is. That's what Rahm Emanuel told you. We want to make sure these guys have a home in the party. And progressives, you don't even have to bring that up. They're afterthought. The catch is, the fact that they're doing that gets across that there's a power, there's a device, there is something that you can do that concerns them to the point that they need to go through this and basically bastardize the left to this degree and inflame this. And believe it or not, accepting that, hey, despite us potentially inflaming the left on this to a point that may hurt us. Look at the polling. We have this much in the lead. These groups, whatever that number is, but it is more important that we do something now to set up a bridge in the future so the progressive base becomes that much more irrelevant in material terms, not just conceptual terms. The left needs to be wary and take heed of this. It's a big deal. You don't want to get to the point where your ability to influence the party is so diminished because of tactics that the party has made that you lose relevance. Because what will have to happen is that whether you want to accept another party or whether you want to be ejected from the Democratic Party, you need to start thinking of yourself as a identity in and of itself, even if that's just an identity within the Democratic Party, but works in tandem in order to affect influence change. They're trying to undermine your position. They're trying to eject you from the party. They're trying to ditch you. But it's rational for them to do so. It's a rational act. You can't fault them for taking a rational act. You fault them because they're not living up to this notion that the overwhelming majority of your party, 88%, nearly unanimous. Now, this is where I make my segue into the left. Because we make ourselves irrelevant. Every time you go and you make a vote for a person that in no way is going to represent your interests because you believe that it is your job to hold back the night instead of the job of the candidate to get your vote, you make yourself that much more irrelevant. And you also hurt your candidate. Because if your candidate actually was forced to appropriate policies that were popular, you may actually energize another contingent of that particular base. The candidate doesn't want to do that. The candidate doesn't care about acting the base. The candidate wants to win in the way that he wants to win because of the way he does his funding and everything else and the opportunities that may be available for him after politics. So it's not an issue of the candidate winning in and of itself. The candidate needs to win in the candidate a particular way. He needs to win without giving you anything. The moment that you force him to appropriate those policies, his chances of winning goes up. But his funding mechanism and everything else becomes somewhat problematic and shaky. I'm making the point that I don't give a shit about his funding mechanism. I care about the policies being implemented, the policies being pushed, and you, as a energized base, holding them accountable by allowing them to potentially lose. It is not your responsibility to get them elected. It is their responsibility to get your vote. That is an inversion of what you've been taught, because what you've been taught has been fundamentally wrong and has been used to keep you in this docile state where you continuously vote for any random Democrat. That needs to stop. They're trying to undermine you right now. So that very edifice, that very thing that is typical in some notion of negotiation where one side leaves the negotiation because they don't necessarily like what's up, they've been teaching you wrong. Sheepdog, Sanders, teaching you wrong. Cenk Uygur, they're teaching you wrong. And these guys are right now trying to undermine your influence in it, the political process. It's in broad daylight. I'm saying don't let them. Appropriate your strength. Appropriate your strength. I can't fault them. It's a rational, logical act. Consider what happened for the moment. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, who was supposed to be inevitable, was almost taken down by a man who calls himself a socialist. That man creates a movement of people that are coming out to tens, 25,000 people at stadiums all across the United States. There's a momentum, there's an energy about him. And Clinton couldn't fill a doghouse, despite the fact having all the sorts of media support, all sorts of political connections and support. And people had already basically signed over their allegiance to Clinton in the first place. But that being said, you're stuck with the idea that, oh my God, this man is dramatically popular. And he even comes across as if he's above politics. That was one of Clinton's complaints. Sanders loses. Sanders was cheated. Now, whether you want to say Sanders was going to lose anyway, so the cheating doesn't matter, let's just agree upon the fact that he was cheated. And that, of course, burns the left. Because ultimately, the left continuously loses in the political space because your issues aren't brought up. It doesn't matter what you want because you're going to ultimately vote for the Democratic anyway. Your position, your tenor, your willingness to just give it all over, whether you're black or whether you're lefty, boils down to the same thing of just incentivizing your irrelevance. I understand you're scared. That's no excuse. You have a responsibility to your country to represent the interests of that country. And just so happen on the left, you are the conscience of this nation, making it that much more for you need to be a lion in this process, not necessarily sleepwalking because you've been given this nonsense of blue no matter who, or you got to vote for the Democrat because the Republican is horrible. Look at your world. You accepting that premise has allowed your country to slide further and further and further to the right, all with you voting for it to do so, despite the fact that you're voting for basically something that you never actually wanted, and the things that you wanted that were actually popular, and especially right now that are popular, getting tossed to the wayside, with the Democratic Party, supposedly the left-leaning party, reaching out to Republicans. It does make more sense for them to be more like Republicans because that's basically what they care about anyway, meaning it's a much easier fit as opposed to having to deal with you and your wants of making sure that the public is okay, of making sure people have decent wages. They don't want to have to deal with that stuff. They want to deal with it to the degree that they want to deal with it. This kind of incrementalist way. And so they try to appropriate Republicans. But I'm saying for you, as the conscience of this nation, to have gone along with it, the problem is, in their eyes, maybe they're not going to continue to go along with it. Let's get these other people. From the standpoint of the left, 2016, Sanders rattles Clinton. Rattles her. He still had a movement of people. Those people were fanatics. Not just fanatics. When that stuff hit the radar, all of those issues of inequality, issues of war, issues of climate, issues of cash, billionaire class, the top 1%, all of that stuff became on radar every day. Because that was Sanders' argument. He stands there, talks about policy for 30, 40 minutes. You can't help but to talk about what he's talking about. And so all of this notion of what it means to be a Democrat and everything else starts to come up. Sanders, does he represent what it means to be a Democrat? Or does Clinton represent what it means to be a Democrat? And many of the people couldn't even answer the question. Well, if you ask Sanders, he will be very specific in what it meant. The catch here is Sanders was an independent beforehand. He's running to reinsole the Democratic Party into what it was back during the days of FDR, with some kind of modern version to it. The Democratic Party was completely against this. But think about what that means. If he's talking about healthcare, if he's talking about wages, if he's talking about income inequality, if he's talking about less war, and you are against those things, what does it mean to be a Democrat if you're against the things that this guy's talking about? Clinton runs. Elizabeth Warren and other Senate Democrats, women, sign a contract in blood for allegiance. This was a secret letter. The rub here is that when Sanders asked Warren to run, well, Warren had already signed her soul over to Hillary Clinton and support. So when Sanders got back in the race, he decided to run. Barn burner, amazing speeches, back and forth. He wins the policy arguments. But again, this is not a policy argument thing. It always boils down to what is the typical Democrat, and they vote on that typical Democrat that they think is going to win, with the added bonus of this woman being a woman. And so you have people who, I don't care what she does, she could have murdered a guy, I just want her to be in office because she's a woman. And then Sanders is sexist because Sanders is asked to run in a race. Hey, are you anti-Semitic because you're running in a race against the first Jewish candidate? Secret letter. Sanders asked Warren to run. Warren had already signed over her name in blood. Sanders and Warren, you would think that there would be an ideological something there, even though it's not a one-to-one. Warren is a far more political actor than Sanders. Sanders is very straightforward in what he wants. Warren is very snake-like in what she'd do in order to accomplish some goal, but her political instincts just don't seem to be all that well. She, instead of backing Sanders, sits out the thing. That's the best and strongest position she thinks she can get. She also goes in and gets pissy because she gives Hillary Clinton a list, and it freaks Hillary Clinton out because Hillary Clinton thinks, oh my God, is she going back on this? Meaning, we had that part sewed up. Because if Sanders is going to run, then at the very least we could trot out Warren to say, well, Hillary Clinton is doing all this lefty stuff and I back Hillary Clinton. It blunts some degree of what Sanders is running on if he's trying to run a lefty agenda. Warren backs Clinton. Warren wants more for the support. And Clinton can't, getting nervous. So Clinton loses. Interregnum. And the catch becomes, we know more likely than not Sanders is going to run again. And we think Biden is going to run again, which means you have these two pillars, Sanders and Biden. The honest thing is, they're not really two pillars. The overwhelming majority of the party, from the standpoint of the brain trust, infrastructure, and everything, is Team Biden, Team Clinton, Team Obama. These guys are not lefties, in a sense what we call lefties, despite the fact they may wear the cloak of it, and they may use FDR and all that history and everything else for their benefit. But they're not lefties. They wink at you. They show you a little leg. And they get you to bite on. And they tell you, look, we may not be perfect, but Republicans are horrible and they're monsters. And you accept that soothing argument and fold in. They understand that they are something different, and as such, they are having meetings. How do we stop Sanders? We need to stop Sanders. We've done everything we could with media by ignoring him or by casting him in a bad light, and he keeps gaining momentum. He just always stays there, and he keeps going up. Warren has collapsed. How do we stop Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, Buttigieg, and many other people in the Democratic brain trust? Sanders is just an avatar of tens of millions of people that's in their party. And there's no way of engaging and to come to some kind of resolution of things. No. How do we stop him? How do we put his ass into the ground? How do we get rid of him? This keeps going on. DNC members talking about a rule change. Again, stop Sanders. Megadona urges Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to pick a candidate in a bid to stop Sanders. Bloomberg jumps into the race. A billionaire, an oligarch, who is no longer trusting that the Democratic Party can do his bidding with him being in the background. So he himself feels, I got to get into this. I used to be a politician. He gets embarrassed. But the fact that the oligarchical class looked at that and said, God, we can't trust that party anymore. We give all of that money to that party. That party does our bidding while, basically the politician is paid to be a front man and paid to sell something to the audience to get them to accept something. Not what the public wants, but what the oligarchical class would settle for and what they would give them, as opposed to allowing the other monsters to come in and compel these people to behave properly. But they were frontmen. When Bloomberg and these other oligarchs didn't believe that they could trust the party, Bloomberg gets in. Now, Sanders looks like he's going to run away with it. Chris Matthews, hey, maybe we should tank it. Instead of letting Sanders change the party for a generation. But understand again, what is Sanders talking about? This is before all the COVID stuff hit. Everybody needs to have health care. 88% support within the party. Schools need to be able to, free colleges and universities, and everybody gets to go to school and get rid of that. 70-something% support within the party. And all of these are even popular outside the party. Increase, expand Social Security. Again, 70-something% outside the party and more inside the party. Policy after policy after policy. All of them popular. All of them are popular. And the response is, we have to stop him. We have to smother him in his grave. South Carolina. Biden comes back to life. Every media, every person, everybody else who can get a microphone says resurgence. And Sanders never once all that much attacked Biden, would never once clarify between himself and Biden, never even tied Biden to the Democratic Party corruption, or for that matter, the Republican Party corruption. Wouldn't even make the point that Joe Biden is lying about his civil rights record. I was the one that was marching with King. Wouldn't even make the point that Elizabeth Warren, she would attack him on the super PAC stuff to clarify those things. He would not engage. It takes off from there. But pause for a moment before South Carolina. Each and every one of those Democrats had this fear that, oh my God, he's going to take it. And it even got to the point when they were at the Democratic the debate. How many of you, if Sanders had more delegates, would cobble in with Sanders? Every last one of them said, we will rip it from its hands at the nomination. Each and every one of them also knows that means they would lose that nomination, because lefties would not necessarily vote for somebody if you rip it out of Sanders' hands. The key point is they didn't care. It was more important to stop Sanders, to stop you, to stop your particular policy agenda of ever getting implemented, as opposed to backing Sanders. Now, you scared them. It freaked them out. The billionaire class, oligarchs, Democrats, it freaked them out. So their response to being freaked out is, we can't trust the left. These guys are getting too rowdy. These guys are getting too uppity. And at some point, they may hit upon the idea that blue no matter who is not real, and that the candidate's responsibility and there should be accountability, but the candidate's responsibility is to get elected. And so when those people walk out and said, look, Medicare for All has 88% Democratic support. You're Democrats. We're in the middle of a pandemic. 40 million people, if not more, is out of health care, meaning combining before and after. You have no excuse. Do your job. Go out there and do the people's agenda. We will no longer accept this. What we will accept is that we, 10 millions of us, that believe that people should have health care, you will get our vote if you accept this policy, all of you, and work on that policy. And you stand on that to the tune of tens of millions. And when they say, wait a minute, you're going to help Trump get elected, you're going to say, no, you're going to help Trump get elected. Because 88% of your public in your party agrees with me, which means who are you representing? 69% agree from the standpoint of the American public. And from a philosophical arc of time being bent, this is it. If you want to win and organize the party in an organic way, in order to be the man who you're saying is a monster, is the end of the world, is the apocalypse, is the destruction of Social Security and Medicare and the Postal Service, the bringer of rain, infinite darkness, Donald Trump. If you want to say that, fair enough. But if you're going to say that and you're not willing to acquiesce to a policy that has the overwhelming majority of support from the standpoint of the entire United States populace that takes those votes, how do you justify that? How do you justify tanking it to a man that you say is the apocalypse itself, just because you don't want to appropriate a policy that the overwhelming majority of the public supports? How can you be so purist and non-representative of your population to do that? If lefties did that, 10, 40 million, how many other people that back Sanders, you will get Medicare for all. Or you will get a Democratic Party that is perfectly willing to shred all notions of credibility from the standpoint of backing policy that works. It's one or the other. They can tell you no. They can tank it. But how do you justify not backing a policy in the middle of a pandemic that has 88% Democratic support? Not to mention 70% thing support. How did this party itself justify that loss? That's your argument. It's a weird quirk that you accept the framing that it is the candidate's responsibility or your responsibility to get somebody else elected. This is a representative government. Either they represent you or you don't. You can't take the cowardly approach because you think your position is weak. No, you push the candidate. But in this case, this is not a random push for some random policy. This is talking about something that is vital for people desperate in our society. And you're playing politics with this nonsense. It's not just politics. These are real people's lives that are taking place. Yeah, from the standpoint of the left, this is the policy you should take. This is the God-honest, moral, ethical policy to take. And you force them. They either accept your policy or lose. That's where you start with this. I understand you think Trump is a maniac, but how long do you go away being that much more irrelevant? And they're already trying to replace you anyway. So you had a socialist that that almost ran away with it. Their response, logically, rationally, is maybe we can't continuously trust the left with these gimmicks that we play in order to keep them in line. You realize, if that works, in this election, despite the fact that Medicare for All was at 88% support, you would have literally delegitimized yourself and took Medicare for All off the table, despite the fact that it has that much support. You're in the middle of a pandemic. These guys are talking about radical centrism. I'm making the point to you that you, as human beings, fuck the politics in the political space. You, as human beings, have to realize that there is so much chaos and trauma that is taking place in your society right now. Ignore the politics for the moment. You have people who have medical bills. You have people who have died, 170, 180,000. That number is supposed to go up to 300,000 by the end of the year. You have people who are being evicted from their homes because the political instrument has no care in the world about doing anything for those people. And so those people get tossed out of their homes in the middle, yes, of a pandemic. On top of those people being evicted from their homes to the tunes of tens of thousands because there are no PPE loans, you also have businesses that now actually have to shut down, meaning the unemployment gets that much worse with companies falling out. So retail goes kaput. those food banks that you see, those long, long lines with these elderly people standing in those lines for hours just to get food and bread, hopefully a little bit of meat so they can get protein. This is our world. This is our world. And these guys are talking about radical centrism. Are you insane? Why would you acquiesce to that under the current circumstances? Your world has already fallen off its axis. And lefties will take this weird stance of accepting the framing that you got to vote for Joe Biden. It's your job to get Joe Biden elected. As opposed to, it is Joe Biden's job to get your vote. And he gets your vote when he represents your interests. And I'm making a point to you that the things that are going on in your outside world go beyond just the typical politics that people play. It goes on to be able to accommodate those interests. And the fact that it is a medical issue, and the fact that it is indeed a pandemic, when I say Medicare for all, and the overwhelming majority of people raise their hands and says yes, and you had 20 Democrats that took shots at it night after night after night after night, and all of them lost. All of them lost. How do you justify not accepting a position? I'm talking about lefties. How do you justify not taking a stand in a position saying you accept Medicare for all or you lose? It is your responsibility to accept Medicare for all, being the Democratic Party and supposedly the party on the left. I shouldn't even have to push you to do this. Meaning I shouldn't even have to be in a position to say you accept this or you don't get a vote. You shouldn't be able to do it just because it's your fucking responsibility to do it as political partners or people who are supposedly running in a race. But this is where we are. The indignity of me and millions of Americans have to stand here to scream at you to do your job. Accept Medicare for all or lose to a man that you've called the apocalypse. If Joe Biden really does believe that Donald Trump is the walking apocalypse, and Joe Biden really does love America, and Joe Biden is so purist that he's not willing to accept 2 or 3 policy agendas, especially that are radically popular, Medicare for all starting off, then why the hell should Joe Biden and Democrats ever get your vote if they're willing to throw this country off the edge in that particular way? If the party is really representative of the public, then this stand shouldn't be an issue. Rationally, the Democratic Party should say, yeah, Trump is a maniac. It's pragmatic for me to take these 50 million or 40 million people and say, okay, fair enough, we're going to appropriate Medicare for all. You're the public. You want it. Trump is a maniac. We don't want to risk the chance of giving it over to a maniac again. So yeah, it's a rational choice for me to do that. Why is it that you accept the Democrats' narrative that a policy agenda that is popular, they can blow off, and that it is still your responsibility to back them despite that they're blowing off? What does it mean when a demand is placed to the tens of millions, the Democrats acknowledge that they will lose without that support, and they still tank it anyway? What does it mean from the standpoint of what that party represents? And what does it even mean from a public that's just been shanked by a party and basically held hostage by that party? No. The argument of the left, the argument of every lefty should honestly be, you get our vote if you accept Medicare for all. And the fact that it is required, warranted, necessary, and more popular than pretty much anything else. Not to mention the medical issue of a pandemic. It is morally right for me to stand here. That is the position of lefties. And you should try to make the Democratic Party justify it's not acquiescing to that policy. Because that's basically what it boils down to. You are literally putting the country at risk as opposed to accepting a policy that you should have accepted anyway, given the overwhelming majority, nearly unanimous support for it in your party. They are trying to erase that step, by the way. What I've just articulated is an assertive policy or assertive action from the standpoint of the left, if the left had an organized idea of what the left was. And even if it doesn't, it should be something that is screamed by every lefty, every opportunity they get in front of every microphone that they can get their hands on. Because that is a strategy that is necessary. And that, by the way, is the one that what they're doing right now is trying to eliminate. You lose power to make them lose if they find a way to mitigate your very existence, which is what they're doing. We're trying to get the right-wingers on their team. This video is probably going far too long. Yeah. But I wanted to explain what was going on, and I wanted to explain it in a way where you can understand the conceptual interlaces between it. Maybe I can cut it or something where it goes piece by piece, but that is what's taking place. That is a particular strategy that if you had tens of millions of people, and it would only have to be a fraction of the people who are backing Sanders, all in one voice in unison say, you get our vote if you represent our interests, and this is our interests. And you give a demand. And that demand is either acknowledged and accepted or not. If it's not accepted, they lose. But it loses with the notion from the American public that the Democratic Party just said, we don't want to accept something that has overwhelming majority support. Fair enough. You have to be willing to do that. That is the only way you can move yourself forward in a political space, especially from the standpoint of understanding that politics is at its heart a negotiation. But it's a negotiation between two sides with power, or at the very least they acknowledge that there's power in those processes. If the left has no ability to appropriate or accentuate its power, then it's not a negotiation anymore. You tag on or don't. But ultimately, you tag on because you're terrified. They know you're terrified. Black, lefties, you incentivize your irrelevance through the cowardice associated with the position. I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I'll leave it. All right. Like, share, and subscribe. I think they were chats. So hold on. Google has changed the way they do their chats. This sucks. Xavier Foster, you keep asking, how are they justifying progressives aside? Aren't you going to find out why? They want you all and populist conservatives gone. Why? Oh, no. Xavier Foster, look. It's very possible that somebody, let's say like Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky would say, if you, let's say 3 a.m. between him and his guy, he may say, look, I agree with you. Your assertive policy gives a demand, and it forces the Democratic Party to acquiesce to that demand or not. Meaning, there's an election. True. The Democratic Party is running. True. Republican Party is running. True. A group, 20, 30, 40 million people, organize. Say, you get our support or you lose. Now, the Democratic Party at this point is in the middle of a campaign, a presidential election. There's a group that is making that demand, and if that demand becomes that much more strident, that much more legit, and those people are fanatic about trying to make sure each and every American gets Medicare for all, then you have to deal with that. You can deal with that by blowing it off, and you can deal with that by accepting it. Either way, the argumentation that is being framed, however, is basically around America, representative government, and how can a party ignore almost a unanimous call by its members? How do other Democrats react to this? Meaning people who maybe are okay with Medicare for all, but weren't necessarily willing to go those lengths, meaning tacit approval. If you have 88% supporting a policy, then yeah, you're going to have a ton of people in tacit approval. You will have people that will be angry and vindictive because they want you to just vote for their candidate. That always happens. But what I'm trying to make the point here is you're trying to intercede in the political space in a way that forces an act, forces a choice, not acquiescing. You accept or not. And you're going to accept or not in the face of America with basically the election itself at stake. Now, it's not so much that I believe Democrats care about Medicare for all. I think they were valid. Everything that Rahm Emanuel said is just true. By the same token, there's a veneer that they have to manage and maintain. And my argument is go dead after that veneer and go dead after in attacking this notion of blue no matter who. And you have to yourself come to some rationalization for how a party that has cast this man as devil himself, the walker, the walking with hoofed feet on America, touching Lady Liberty inappropriately. This is how they cast this man. If they're going to say, we would rather lose and let Trump take it, the devil himself take it over, as opposed to acquiesce to a demand with near unanimous support from our party, that means something. And each and every Democrat that believed the Democratic Party was something has to come to some reconciliation about what that means. Wow. They really would rather tank it to Trump than appropriate a policy that I actually agree with. Yes, that's where I'm saying it needs to go. Your point is, you know the Democratic Party don't care about it. I know that. But I'm saying that needs to be made abundantly clear to the public itself so the public itself knows who they are. This non-representative party that would literally prefer Trump to win it as opposed to taking on any level of policy that is positive. I think it's important to have that clarified. And if they don't want to clarify it in those terms, then they accept the policy. From my standpoint, it's a win-win. A, lefties start appropriating power in the political space and can assert leverage based upon a known, clear ability for them to do so. That's one point. Or they acquiesce and take the policy. That's the way I see it. I mean, you can fight on multiple levels, and there is this kind of level that's explicit in regards to a mask that somebody may want to maintain, and so you can attack the mask, in which case they may make responses to the mask. But no, Xavier, I think that's the policy that needs to be taking place. And they wouldn't be trying to bring these additional Republicans in if they thought they had the lefties under wraps. Did you check out that article in the Correspondent? I saw something in the Correspondent, Trudy. I need a little bit more, and I'll check the thing. Thanks for not making the pivot. Oh, pivot? Oh, fuck no. You know I'm not pivoting. Please reach out to Ray McGovern and Bill Barney for an interview. We're probably going to get them for fault lines. So one way or the other, we'll get them. Wesley Walker Jr. Thank you, Wesley Walker. And of course, you guys know I'm not going to make a pivot on this channel. I'm pretty much clear in regards to my politics. G5, thank you, G5. I appreciate that. Linda Lee U123. Obama wasn't Hitler. He forgave torture and spared illegal. Oh, we read that one. All right, guys. This video has gone monstrously long. So I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.